Hi everyone and welcome to this webinar. My name's Jaya and I'm one of the product marketing managers here at Tink looking after payments and accounts products. I'm here with Varun and Kevin, also from the Tink team, and we're going to talk to you about Pay by Bank. More specifically, how Pay by Bank can help you enhance the user experience. Just to give a bit of context, Pay by Bank is a payment method that you might see at checkout. It might sit alongside something like PayPal or card and is an option for shoppers to pay directly from their banking app. The content of this session is intended for anyone, whether you're new to Pay by Bank, whether you're in the process of deciding if it's for your business, or if you're looking to enhance and optimize your existing Pay by Bank process. This webinar is for you. Now, Kevin, can I ask you to introduce yourself and also talk to us a little bit about why Pay by Bank is important?
Yeah, thanks, Jaya. Hi, everybody. My name's Kevin Ward. I am very fortunate to run 3 different verticals at Tink globally. So I run the account development, the partnership, and the delivery verticals. So we are effectively the customer-facing domain for Tink. So we have huge amounts of interaction with all of our customers on a daily basis. And Varun and I work very closely together on optimizing those customers' UX as well. So that's a bit about me. But as far as why Pay by Bank, there are so many reasons. I could literally take up this whole webinar just explaining why, but I'll try to be reasonably succinct. So what we try to do at Tink, we try to strip back the open banking UX to make it as simple for our merchants and customers to understand. While stripping that back, if you think about it, we just want the customer to think they're opening their banking app, basically. That's it. That's all that is required to initiate a payment to a merchant to buy something, So first of all, it gives that consumer choice at the point of sale. So our merchants are giving consumers what they want because lots of consumers are already utilizing Pay by Bank. It gives them that convenience because they are using a trusted payment method. They know how to do this payment. They've done it hundreds of times a year, and it's very, very intuitive for them. So there's a lot of simplicity based around open banking. Really important part is security. So ultimately, they have to go through a secure customer authentication, and they do that biometrically or with their fingerprint. Crucially, I think that it's a very cost-effective proposition for our merchants. It's very important on both sides of the coin. It allows the merchant to give that choice and flexibility to the consumer, and it allows the consumer to ease through a payment method. And we'll talk in more depth about UX and the pace at which we can transact a payment method. It's going to be very, very important moving forward because, as we all know as consumers, we are getting more and more impatient. And so, when we log in, we want things to be easy.
Varun, you're going to show us a little bit about what the UX looks like in different regions. Could you just introduce yourself and also talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Varun. I head up our customer experience product domain here at Tink. And what that means is that we're the set of product teams that work on improving the user experience, building all of our front-end products. It's I would say a good bunch of people that work here, a combination of product managers, engineering managers, designers, copywriters, etc. So very, very fun group of people to work with. I just wanted to follow up on something that Kevin said about when we talk about the UX of open banking or Pay by Bank, what does that actually mean? And I think it's a really interesting description to refer to it as just the act of a user logging into their bank account, right? Now, obviously, this is different depending on the market. In the UK, we are mostly used to using our bank apps, using Face ID on our phones to just log into a bank app and then complete whatever the action is that you're trying to do. In Germany, there's different ways of logging into your bank account. In Sweden, where I live, there's a different way of logging into your bank account. So there are specificities to how you actually go through that login process that is different per market. So that's an interesting point, right? And from Tink's perspective, and the value that we really offer to our customers is that we simplify that complexity. We are the ones building all of these connections to banks, thousands of banks across Europe. and then trying to figure out what happens next. Okay, if I'm in Sweden, I need to call this authentication method. In the UK, I need to call this authentication method versus Germany. So that's the real value that we can also provide. And then on top of that, building the right user experience so it feels really seamless. And it's technically actually much, much more challenging than you might think. Yeah.
I bet it is. Just moving on to the user journey, Varun, can you show us what Pay by Bank looks like?
Absolutely. So let's start with a pay by bank flow in the UK. I will assume that people watching this video are probably not very familiar with how the user journey usually looks like. So I'll keep it quite simple and high level. So you would typically see pay by bank in the context of a checkout, right? There's a bunch of different payment methods, and you have pay by bank there. Interesting thing there is obviously the recognition, the brand recognition that you get by seeing your bank logos, right? We're not talking about a small Swedish startup that's rolling out a new payment method. This is something that a user should be quite familiar with. So then you go into the actual sort of flow. The first step in any pay by bank journey is the act of getting consent from the end user. From there, we show you a screen where you see a list of banks that are relevant to your country. In most cases in the UK, for example, we're talking about the top 9-10 banks, the CMA 9 plus another 6 or 7 different banks. But the complexity from a technical standpoint here is that Tink is connecting to thousands of banks in Europe, right? And then to show them in the right order based on our data, we can see, okay, which bank should be shown first in the checkout flow versus should we be showing this alphabetically, or are there any other smarter ways for us to optimize the performance of the screen? So that all of that complexity is taken care of by our teams. So that's the sort of bank selection step, very crucial part of the whole flow. After that, we start the authentication process. In the UK, as we talked about earlier, you primarily use your bank app to log into your account, right? So that's what's happening here in this case. We're using HSBC Bank as an example. So we're logging you into your HSBC Bank, and then the rest of the transaction, you see a summary of how much the transaction is worth, where you're paying the money, and then you do a strong customer authentication. And after that, you are sent back to the merchant where you see that the payment was successful, and that's really it. There are obviously some complexities that we as an industry and the banks and as a whole need to work on, because there are some cases in which the journeys can be longer. But in general, for the majority of the banks and for the most, I would say most scalable, most obvious use cases, the journeys are very, very smooth.
Right. And why do we have that difference in different markets? What is it that makes...
Great question. It's about authentication methods. So let me take the example of the UK versus, say, Sweden. I can show you what it looks like in Sweden. All right, now let's take a look at the Swedish version of the flow. So let's just assume it's a similar sort of use case where in a checkout flow, you see a list of payment methods and with pay by bank on top. And the first step, like in any open banking flow, is where you need to give consent. And in Sweden, it's the same thing. And from there, we come to the bank selection step. And here we see a different list of banks, right? Because it's fundamentally differs per market. And from that point onwards, that's where the flows start to change a little bit. Whereas in the UK version, the user was authenticating within their bank. In a Swedish flow, what happens is it's a two-step process. The first step is you confirming your identity, you telling the bank that, okay, this is me. And then the second step is where you actually make the payment. And the way we do that in Sweden is through something called Bank ID. Now, Bank ID is an authentication app, a third-party authentication app that's used by pretty much every Swede to log into public services, to log into the bank accounts, to make payments. And it's something that we are very used to using. And it just, it's an app installed on your phone. You click on, you're going through the flow, you click on confirm your identity, and then you're taken to Bank ID. where you authenticate and you come back. So, and this is maybe a tricky one to understand the first time, but you're shown a list of accounts. And the best way I can explain this is, say you have, you're taking out your wallet to make a payment and you have 3 or 4 different cards and you would like to pick which card you want to make that payment from. So it's a very similar idea here that you're shown presented with a list of accounts and then you need to pick an account you would like to make the payment from. So at this point, you've completed the first step, which is to confirm your identity and selecting the account that you want to pay from. And we start the second step, which is the confirmation of the payment and initiating the payment from the bank account. And again, this is done through Bank ID. So you start the payment confirmation process, you go into Bank ID, authenticate there, and then you go back and the payment was successful. So this is the sort of 2-step process for making a payment in Sweden. But there is a way to shorten this into, to remove that first step of the flow and actually just go straight back into just confirming the payment. So the way it works in Sweden is we do actually have the ability to store the user's bank account information, right? So let's say you've made a payment to a merchant, and if we're able to save that data, the next time you come and make a payment with that merchant, we can skip the part of the flow where you actually have to pick your bank account and the first step of the authentication process. And then the flow looks very different. So if we take the same example, but this is, let's say it's a returning user. It's I've paid with this merchant before and I'm coming back 3 or 4 days later to buy something else. In this case, the consent part remains the same. We still need to get consent. But then you skip the whole step around selecting your bank account, authenticating. You go straight into confirming your payment. And what that looks like is one SCA. You go into the confirmation of the payment step and you go through Face ID, and that's it.
So that's actually quite an important optimization step, really, because it will mean that a journey could be shortened almost immediately after the customer has signed up.
Exactly. Important point on that optimization piece. This is not something that the customer needs to configure, right? This is something that Tink can take care of as well. So the reason why we're bringing this up is it's important for you to know that there is a difference between the experience between a first-time user versus a returning user. For a returning user, the experience can be much, much snappier.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on to optimization then. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can integrate. So another way that you can cut down on the journey time is the mode of integration that you use. So we've got a web SDK and we've also got a mobile SDK. Would you explain that for us a little bit, Varun?
Yeah, absolutely. So the example that you saw earlier was, let's say somebody is on a website, a retailer, and they're buying something directly from their mobile phone. Now, there are some differences between how different platforms handle redirects and moving between, switching from one app to the other. Very simply put, if your product is an app, let's say a retailer that has a mobile app, an Amazon type experience or something like that. What you can actually do is you can utilize the native platform's system APIs to skip certain steps in the user journey. So let's take this example that I have on the screen now. So this is an ordinary user journey where the user is going from sort of the consent screen that we talked about before. This is the bank selection. And then this is the screen that we have in the flow right now, which is used to trigger the mobile banking app. And then you have another screen towards the end of the flow where you redirect the user back towards the merchant. What happens with the mobile SDK is we can use the system API. So if your product is a mobile app, we can skip this step and this step. So it looks a little bit like this. So the journey becomes so intuitive. You go from a consent screen, you go into the bank selection screen, directly into the bank app where you authenticate and you go back in. So these are the sort of, I know it seems trivial, right? We're talking about 2 screens and does it really matter? But yes, these are the optimizations that really matter that go into creating a smooth user journey. And this is the kind of sort of detail that you would expect somebody like Tink to take care. Right, this is where we provide value to our customers. Another one of those optimizations that seems relatively small on the surface but has a huge impact on conversion.
Absolutely. I think if your world is in optimization, then this is clearly really valuable. You can see here it's really significantly shortened the journey, just down to 4 steps. Another really important part of how a business can take control of their flow is in our customization and white labeling. So we're going to talk a little bit about the view that a business has of managing their Tink account from the Tink console. There are a lot of benefits to being able to control the experience. What are those for merchants?
Yeah, so I think there's loads of important points here. I think first and foremost, the look and feel needs to be consistent with the merchant's look and feel. They need to be able to speak to their own customers in their own voice. So a customer needs to come onto the merchant website and feel very familiar with the environment that they're coming into. We all know in e-commerce, especially, it's very hard to get a consumer to a website. It's even harder to get them to convert. So we want to make sure we are, very much a part of that. Whether it's simple things like color palettes, whether it's positioning, all the basics that you would expect. But I think, the most important bit is the white labeling aspect. I think it's essential that Tink is invisible in that process, and it feels like the merchant's payment method. And we've got lots of merchants we're talking to who are really looking at taking that to the next level. So, can they have it as their go-to payment method that is maybe linked to their loyalty scheme? So it's driving that adoption, driving the consumer back. And we're having lots of great conversations with very, very big retailers on how we get that up and running and what it needs to look like. So I think if you think about it, it really comes down to a consistent look and feel that drives trust, that drives familiarity. And if you nail those things, the conversion looks after itself, in my experience. And then I think second to that, we wanted to make sure that our proposition was very scalable at a high level of pace. So if we think about some of our big partners like Adyen, the PSP, they are our merchant of record. So ultimately, it is their payment method. It is Adyen's pay by bank, and they want to make that scalable to the largest merchants in Europe that they have on their payment stack. So we need to make sure, as a partner, we're taking away that friction to make sure it's customizable for them as a PSP, so they can roll it out to their merchants very quickly through our integration at pretty much a flick of a switch. Nothing's ever that simple, but genuinely, it's very, very straightforward because of the integration that we already have. So I think when you think about white labeling and customization, the whole key to it is that scalability and also the look and feel. Because again, the consumer wants to trust the process. So if we go right back to the start when we were talking about trusting their bank app and their bank ID, if you interlock that with the look and feel of the merchant's website, I think you're on to an absolute winner. And we're definitely seeing that in the adoption.
Yeah. And also, I think that's a really, really valid point, especially about the way Adyen use it, because it really means they can take ownership of it as a payment method. And that's, I think, the really kind of key to how it will be used in the market, that it will be relatively invisible.
Yeah, and so it should be, because obviously we all know Tink and we all know who Adyen are because we're in sort of the payments world. But think about the end consumer. They want to be able to go onto a website like Hugo Boss, for instance, and say, "Oh, brilliant! I'm used to coming on here. There's a new payment method. It's in the Hugo Boss colors. It's in their UX and their UI. Let's click on this and see where it goes." And once they use it once, our stats suggest that the customers come back time and time again. So that look and feel is very, very important. And giving it easily to Adyen to customize that for their merchants is something we've worked a lot on and worked very hard on. And the fact that it's so quick to implement now is a real plus for the merchant and the end consumer.
Yeah. All right, so we've got the console screen up here. We can see the a few of the login and the customizable elements on the screen. Varun, can you just talk us through the UI here?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. So on the screen now, what you're looking at is a set of developer tools that we have inside of the Tink console that allow you to change the branding elements such as colors and backgrounds and button shapes and accents and things like that. And all of this for the purpose of making your pay by bank flow sort of melt in really nicely into your own brand or product, so it feels like a connected experience. So I'm going to use a fake brand that we created for this demo. I just uploaded a logo for a brand called Pay Nuevo, and now I'm going to start to add some of the other brand elements to make it fit nicely. So let's start with, let's say, the text. I'm going to change the color of the primary text to match the color of the logo. So as you can see, it's now blue in color on every single screen. Then I'm going to take a secondary accent and apply that to, say, for example, the button here, like this. I'm going to change the shape and make it rounded. I'm also going to make it full width. And let me just publish that for a second and see what that looks like. And as you can see, so now I've added the logo to the header. We've changed the color of the text so it matches the logo. We've changed the background colors here, and we've changed the shape of the button. And the button especially is a really important sort of graphical element of any sort of modern digital experience, right? So you have a fair few options here to be able to get it looking just like your own. Yeah, so that's a bit of a demo of some of the options that we have inside of the Tink console. You have other options such as using custom fonts or being able to use dark theming. And all of these are customizable options that are available to customers right now.
Wow, that's really useful. And you can really see that that's going to stop the experience feeling in any way jarring to a user, because it just feels like intuitively part of the experience. Okay, we are just about ready to wrap up. Varun, would you mind summarizing just a little bit about what merchants need to think about?
Yeah. So I think just to sort of wrap things up, we've talked about optimizations in a few different ways. So I'll summarize it in 3 points. So the first one would be around Tink owning the connectivity piece and layering the UX on top of that, right? We built all of these connections to thousands of banks across Europe. And by having all of that connectivity built in-house, we also have the opportunity to make sure that we can optimize the UX on top of that. This is a huge differentiation. It requires a lot of engineering muscle, which we have internally at Tink. The second point of that was, once we build these underlying connections, we can start to chip away at some of these additional screens and the friction that you see in the flow. We showed you the example of a 1 SCA versus a 2 SCA flow. Sweden, we're live with 2 SCA for our biggest customer, and it's now applicable to all Swedish customers of Tink, really. Then the other one was around using the mobile SDK, right, where you're again able to use optimize the mobile experience for certain customers if you have a mobile app, and cut more screens in the flow. So that's point number 2. And the third one was around the customization aspect of open banking and pay by bank, which is where you can really make pay by bank sit beautifully inside of your own flows. You can name it depending on the use case. So there's all of these different things that come together to really provide an experience that is top notch.
Yeah. And Kevin, what about your summary?
Yeah, great summary from Varun as always. I think that, from a product perspective, he's absolutely nailed it there. I think that when it comes to commercially, I'll give probably a slightly different view from maybe a merchant side and a consumer side. So I think for a merchant, the access to new customers is very important. There's a lot of people using Pay by Bank already. That's going to just keep growing and growing. And I think that, merchants are now starting to miss a trick if they haven't got it added to their payment stack. I think that why is that important? Because there is an enhanced user experience. We've proved that there is an enhanced user experience, and I think that that's really important because the consumer expects a lack of friction these days, and we are working very hard to make sure that is continuing. That lack of friction drives more transactions, more conversion, so very important for a merchant to think about. As we discussed at the start, is cost saving. So merchants with high levels of transactions can really look at it as a tool to start driving down their their cost to serve, which allows them to invest more in their consumer and their end consumer.
That's great. Thank you both so much for sharing your insights with us today. And it's, been a really insightful presentation. If you want to read more about it, we've got our UX guide, which we'll be sharing along with this video. So download it and see what you might learn something else. All right, that's all. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Jaya. Thanks, Kevin.